The desert heat pressed down on Fallujah like a weight, heavy and relentless. It was close to 2:30 p.m., and the air shimmered above the rooftops, turning the city into a mirage of dust and metal. First Lieutenant Sarah Reeves lay in her ghillie suit, motionless, every muscle trained to ignore the sting of the sun. 3 days in the same overwatch position had burned the edges of her patience, but her breathing remained steady, her eye fixed through the scope of her Mach 12 SPR. When she finally returned to the forward base, the smell of sand and diesel followed her. Soldiers lounging near the recreation tent glanced up, their conversation dipping just long enough for someone to smirk. They joked about the coordinates tattooed on her neck, trading cheap laughs as she passed. She didn't respond. The tattoo wasn't decoration, and it wasn't a mistake. It was a mark of memory. One, she carried the way, other soldiers carried medals. Inside the dim corridor of the operations tent, she checked her gear again. Quiet and deliberate. The way she always did, her movements were exact, almost rehearsed, as if order itself was her defense against everything that didn't belong. The voices of her teammates drifted faintly through the thin walls, their laughter trailing behind her. She ignored it. Her focus belonged elsewhere. Then the radio cracked through the silence. Rough and sudden. Phantom. This is TOC. Her gloved hand hovered above the transmitter as she exhaled once. Slow and controlled. The sound of static filled the room, the screen fading to black with the words, "The Ghost of Fallujah." The sun had burned across the rooftops of Fallujah for 3 long days, and the heat felt like it was melting through her skin. From her position on the ridge, First Lieutenant Sarah Reeves lay completely still, her ghillie suit blending with the cracked sand and sparse brush. It was 7:15 a.m. when she adjusted her scope for the 3rd time. Steadying her breathing as the wind shifted slightly from the south, her voice came low and calm through the radio. Phantom actual. Holding overwatch position. The reply from the TOC was faint through static to a simple acknowledgement, and then silence again. The world narrowed to the view. Through her scope and the slow rhythm of her pulse, she tracked distant movement, scanning alleyways and rooftops, marking potential threats with calm precision. The Mach 12 SPR rifle was an extension of her body now. Every adjustment, every breath, measured. The spotter who had rotated in the previous day muttered complaints about the heat, but Sarah barely noticed. Endurance had become her nature. She didn't look for comfort, didn't expect thanks. What mattered was that when she spoke, her voice stayed steady. And when she fired, the result was final. When the order came to stand down, she made her way back to the forward operating base. The dust caking her uniform and skin. Inside the debrief tent, Commander William Mitchell glanced up from a tablet, his uniform sharp even in the chaos of the desert. "Nice shot, Lieutenant. Clean work." His tone held the practiced neutrality of an officer acknowledging results, but his eyes still measured her. He wasn't convinced she belonged there. Sarah stood at attention, nodded once, and left without reply. She'd learned long ago that talk changed nothing. That night, the rec tent hummed with low laughter and the shuffle of cards. A few of the operators played poker, their sleeves rolled up, rifles propped beside them. When Sarah passed, the conversation paused, and one of them grinned. Coordinates on her neck. Right? Probably the address of a nail salon. The others laughed. She didn't break stride. Didn't look back. Outside, the air was cooler, the night stretching quiet across the desert. She reached up, fingertips brushing the back of her neck where the tattoo lay beneath her collar. The numbers were etched into her skin, but deeper still into her memory, the place her brother had fallen 2 years earlier. She drew a breath, slow and even, then kept walking. The morning briefing began just after 6:30 a.m., the operations tent thick with the smell of coffee and sand. Maps and satellite images covered the table. the light from a single overhead bulb, casting sharp shadows across the room. Commander William Mitchell stood in front of a digital display showing the eastern sector of Fallujah. His voice was calm, methodical, the tone of someone who had led too many missions to count. Intel confirms 3 American aid workers captured 3 days ago, believed to be held here. Inside this compound on the city's edge, he pointed to a walled structure marked in red on the map. The room went still. Sarah Reeves leaned closer, studying the map. The coordinates on the lower corner of the screen caught her attention. Her stomach tightened. They were only a few hundred meters from the numbers tattooed on her neck. The place where her brother's unit had gone dark 2 years earlier. She didn't move, but her pulse picked up a quick rhythm that she forced under control. When Mitchell assigned roles, his voice cut through the tension. "Lieutenant Reeves, you'll provide overwatch from this ridge here." He traced his finger along the western rise of terrain. Sarah spoke carefully, her tone measured. "Recommend overwatch from the east ridge. Sire, it offers better sightlines on the compound and potential exfil routes." Mitchell didn't look up. "We'll follow Colonel Collins's recon plan. That's final." The team began to disperse, grabbing gear lists and call signs. The low hum of conversation filled the tent again. A mix of anticipation and fatigue. Master Sergeant Dawson brushed past her, his shoulder catching hers deliberately. "Try not to break a nail out there." "Lieutenant, some of us have work to do." She didn't answer. She just stepped aside, keeping her eyes forward, her face unreadable. Outside, the early light was already harsh against the sandbags and razor wire. Sarah paused, her hand drifting unconsciously to the back of her neck. The coordinates were more than numbers now. They were a warning, and as she watched the horizon, a quiet certainty settled over her that something about this mission was already wrong. The night settled over Fallujah without a trace of moonlight. The wind had died, and the temperature finally dropped from the brutal heat of the day. Lieutenant Sarah Reeves lay prone on the ridge assigned by the commander, her body blending with the dirt and rock. She checked the chamber on her Manj 12 SPR, loaded a fresh magazine, and adjusted the optic until the reticle came into perfect focus. Each click of the dial sounded loud against the still air. Below her, the city slept, silent but heavy with something that felt alive. Through her thermal scope, she watched the 6-man assault team move across the narrow streets. Their infrared strobes faint glimmers in her view, SEALs and Rangers working side by side, each motion practiced. Their rifles tucked tight against their vests. They crossed the open ground in perfect rhythm, pausing only to check corners. Sarah keyed her radio softly. Phantom in position. Eyes on compound. No visible movement. The reply from the TOC came low and clear. Copy. Phantom. Maintain overwatch. For a moment, everything felt routine. The kind of mission that runs by the book until it doesn't. Sarah's eyes scanned the compound again, tracing every line, every shadow. Then something caught her attention, a faint flash of reflected light from a structure beyond the northeast wall. It wasn't on the recon imagery. She steadied her breath and pressed the transmit button. Possible movement northeast of the target. Second-story window. The radio crackled with static before Mitchell's voice came back. Steady and firm. Negative. Intel confirms that building as abandoned. Proceed as planned. Sarah hesitated, her finger still resting on the transmitter. Her instincts told her the light wasn't a mistake. Years of field experience whispered that something was wrong. But discipline held her back. Orders were orders. She adjusted her scope again, locking in on the compound's gate as the assault team stacked for breach. The lead operator signaled, and a dull thud broke the silence as the charge detonated. Dust lifted in the thermal view, and movement blurred. A single bead of sweat rolled down Sarah's cheek, catching the glow of her display as she whispered under her breath. Here we go. The first breach charge hit the compound gate, shaking the ground beneath Sarah's chest. Dust rose through the thermal view as the assault team flowed in, weapons up, their movements clean and professional. For 2 heartbeats, the silence held, and then everything collapsed into chaos. Gunfire erupted from every direction. The crack of AK rounds echoed off concrete walls, the sound sharp and vicious. Muzzle flashes lit the compound like lightning. Through her scope, Sarah saw 2 men drop immediately, one clutching his leg, another dragged behind cover by a teammate. Phantom. This is command. Provide immediate overwatch. Mitchell's voice came through the radio. Clipped and steady beneath the noise, Sarah's world narrowed to her scope and the rhythm of her breathing. She tracked the nearest shooter, centered her crosshairs, and fired. The target fell. Another muzzle flash appeared in a window to the east. She adjusted windage by instinct, fired again, and watched the shape disappear. Taking heavy contact. Multiple hostiles. North and east buildings. The reply came from the ground team, half drowned by static and gunfire. The enemy had the advantage of elevation, firing from multiple structures outside the compound. They knew the team was coming. The timing, the angles, everything felt too precise. Sarah shifted to a new firing position, her elbows digging into the dirt. The bipod steady against the ridge. She squeezed the trigger again, the rifle kicking softly into her shoulder. 3 rounds, 3 hits. But for every hostile she dropped, 2 more appeared. The night lit with the dull bloom of explosions. A sudden flare of light blinded her for a second, followed by the deep thump of an RPG. The blast hit near the center of the compound, throwing debris skyward. Her headset crackled, and then went dead. The TOC feed was gone. She tried again. Phantom to command. Radio check. Nothing but static. Mitchell's last words bled through, distorted and faint. They know we're... The signal cut out. She pulled away from the scope and took a breath. The ridge that had been her sanctuary was now useless. The enemy fire was too heavy. The team too exposed. She broke position, slid her rifle into its drag bag, and slung it tight. A quick chamber check. Full magazine. She switched her night vision goggles on and adjusted the focus until the terrain ahead glowed faint green. Below, tracer fire stitched across the compound. The assault team was pinned and isolated. Sarah tightened the strap on her sling, checked her M9 sidearm, and began her descent. Every movement was deliberate. Her boots, finding each foothold in silence. Small bursts of gunfire echoed from the valley as she reached the bottom of the slope. The air smelled of cordite and smoke. She could still hear the team's gunfire mixing with the shouts of insurgents. Without hesitation, she started forward, keeping low, her silhouette hidden in the shadows. Orders or not, she was going in. Sarah moved through the darkness with deliberate precision, each step calculated to stay beneath the enemy's line of sight. The ridge behind her had disappeared into shadow, the sounds of battle pulling her toward the compound below. She reached the outer wall and steadied her rifle, the suppressor catching the faint gleam of distant fire. The first sentry appeared in her scope. 1 shot. Center mass. A second figure turned, confused. Another quiet burst. The third barely had time to raise his weapon before he dropped, his body crumpling soundlessly into the dirt. Sarah paused, scanned for movement, then advanced. The compound was chaos. Bullets tore through windows, the air thick with dust and debris. She ducked through a hole in the wall and switched to her M9, moving room to room, her shoulders low, muzzle steady. A wounded SEAL crawled toward her. Clutching his arm, she helped him behind cover, checked the corridor, and pressed on. Her voice came calm through the squad net. Friendly inside. Moving toward your position. The radio hissed with static, but no reply came. She found Mitchell and Dawson pinned behind a crumbling wall near the central courtyard. 2 men were down beside them, one already gone. Mitchell's face was streaked with sweat and blood, his rifle empty. When he saw her, his eyes widened. "Reeves, what the hell are you doing here? Getting you out alive." "Sire." Her answer came between controlled bursts as she fired at the advancing enemy. She dropped the last man in her line of sight and took a breath. "There's a tunnel system under this place. It's not on your map." Mitchell frowned. How do you know that she turned her head just enough for him to see the edge of the tattoo on her neck? "Because I've been here before. My brother died in these tunnels 2 years ago." For a moment, even the noise around them seemed to fade. Then a metallic clink cut through the air. A grenade rolled across the ground and stopped near Dawson's boot. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed him and threw herself over his body as the explosion ripped through the wall. The blast knocked the wind from her chest, shrapnel tearing into her back. Dawson stared at her, dazed. "Why would you do that?" Her voice was steady, even as she winced in pain. "Because that's what soldiers do." Mitchell's radio crackled back to life. He met her eyes and made the decision. "Follow her lead. We move east." The remaining men gathered what they could and fell in behind her. Sarah rose, blood soaking through her vest, and took point. Her voice came through the calm, quiet but certain. "Move now. Stay tight. Cover left and right." They pushed into the smoke and gunfire, following the one person who still seemed to know the way out. The air in the tunnels was thick with dust and smoke. Every breath burned Sarah Reeves' throat as she led the survivors deeper underground. Her rifle raised, flashlight dimmed to a soft glow. The narrow walls pressed close, the ceiling so low she had to crouch as she moved. Behind her, Commander Mitchell supported a limping Dawson, his boots dragging through the dirt. The rest of the team followed in silence, their nerves frayed, their weapons trembling slightly in tired hands. The echo of distant gunfire rolled through the passage. Like a heartbeat, Sarah knew these tunnels. The turns, the dead ends. The cracks in the walls were carved into her memory. 2 years earlier, she had fled through the same route after her brother's team was ambushed. Now she traced those same steps, every corner stirring flashes of memory she forced aside. She stopped long enough to mark a wall with chalk and signaled for 2-man spacing. Her hand gestures were sharp and precise. "Left turn ahead. Watch your 6." The team followed without a word, their trust unspoken. The deeper they went, the more the sound of pursuit grew. Sarah paused, listening. The faint rhythm of boots and muffled voices echoed down the tunnel. They were being followed. She turned to Mitchell and spoke in a whisper. "Take them to the extraction point. I'll hold them here." Mitchell shook his head, refusing, but her eyes stayed steady. "It's tactical. Sire, they don't know these tunnels. I do." For a moment, his resistance faded. He nodded once, the kind of silent understanding shared only between soldiers who have seen too much. He took Dawson's arm and moved forward, disappearing into the dark. Sarah stayed behind, checking her magazine. 12 rounds. She adjusted her position near a junction, the perfect choke point. When the first hostile appeared, she fired 2 quick bursts and moved. The gunfire echoed wildly, bouncing off walls, making it sound like a full squad. She used the chaos to reposition, firing again from a new angle. When her rifle went dry, she switched to her M9. The recoil sharp against her wounded shoulder, she hit one, then another. Before the slide locked open, the tunnel went quiet again until a figure lunged out of the darkness. She dropped the empty pistol and drew her KA bar, the blade catching a flash of light. The fight was close. Despérate. The sound of struggle filled the narrow passage, grunts and impact blending with the ringing in her ears. When it ended, the only sound left was her breathing. She leaned against the wall, blood seeping through her sleeve, and listened to the silence that followed. Ahead, a faint shaft of light broke through the tunnel ceiling. She started toward it, limping but alive. The echoes of battle fading behind her as the first hint of dawn touched the dust-filled air. The first light of dawn crept over the skyline of Fallujah as the survivors reached the extraction point near the old marketplace. The ground trembled beneath the rotor wash of a UH-60 Blackhawk, hovering low, its engines roaring against the quiet morning. Dust swirled around the landing zone as medics rushed to pull the wounded aboard. Shouting over the noise, while Mitchell coordinated the exfil, Dawson leaned against the skids, blood seeping through fresh bandages, his face drawn and pale. The pilot was ready to lift off when Mitchell's voice cut through the radio. Hold. Movement at the tunnel. Every head turned. Out of the haze and sunlight, a figure appeared small, limping, half covered in dirt and blood. Sarah Reeves moved slowly toward them, her rifle slung across her shoulder, her uniform torn to ribbons. The dust clung to her like a second skin. The team froze, watching in silence as she reached the helicopter and climbed aboard without a word. The roar of the rotors faded into a strange, quiet, as if even the wind was holding its breath. Mitchell sat across from her, holding his tablet, eyes scanning the data that had come through before the comms went dark. 17 confirmed kills, all in the tunnels. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. No one spoke. Dawson watched her from the opposite seat, disbelief softening into something like reverence. Sarah sat hunched forward, elbows on her knees, her face hidden behind grime and exhaustion. She didn't look at anyone. Her gaze stayed fixed on the fading skyline. The helicopter lifted, carrying them away from the burning city below. The coordinates on her neck were barely visible beneath the blood and dust, their meaning known now to everyone aboard. As the compound disappeared behind them, the desert opened wide, silent and endless. Sarah closed her eyes, the hum of the rotors steady in her ears. The ghost of Fallujah was leaving, but her story had just begun. The ceremony took place just after 900 hours at Forward Operating Base Falcon. The desert air was still, and the sound of boots shifting on gravel echoed faintly across the formation yard. Flags stirred in a soft breeze as soldiers stood in formation. Uniforms pressed. Fats es Solem. Commander Mitchell stepped to the podium, his voice steady and formal. Today, we recognize First Lieutenant Sarah Reeves for extraordinary valor in combat. He paused, the words hanging in the dry air. She has been recommended for the Silver Star. The line of soldiers remained silent, their eyes fixed forward. Among them stood Dawson, his arm still wrapped in a sling. His face was leaner now, marked by something deeper than injury. When Mitchell finished speaking, Dawson stepped out of formation and faced Sarah. He spoke quietly but clearly, his voice rough. I was wrong about you. Lieutenant, we all were. You saved every one of us that night. You earned our respect the only way that matters. The words were simple, unpolished. But in the silence that followed, they carried weight. Sarah stood at attention, eyes forward, posture perfect. She didn't smile, didn't show emotion. Her reply came with calm dignity. Just doing my job. Sergeant. The tone was not proud, only honest. A round hair. The same men who had once mocked her tattoo now stood still. The unspoken acknowledgement, passing between them like a quiet current. Mitchell gave a small nod, his expression softer than usual. Later, inside her quarters, Sarah removed her cap and looked into the mirror above her cot. The reflection showed a soldier, not the outsider she had once been. Her fingers brushed the tattoo on her neck. The numbers no longer hurt to touch. They belonged to her past, but they also marked what she had become. A survivor, a leader. Outside, the noise of helicopters faded into the distance. The routine rhythm of a base still at war, she packed her gear slowly, readying for reassignment. This time, there were no whispers, no glances as she passed, only quiet respect. For the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. 6 months had passed since Fallujah. The air at Fort Benning hung thick with summer heat, the kind that settled into a soldier's uniform and stayed there. On the sniper range, rows of new recruits lay prone behind their rifles, their faces marked with sweat and concentration. Somewhere behind them, whispers moved through the line. They said she was a legend, the ghost of Fallujah, a story told in every special operations unit about a sniper who saved her team and walked out of a city no one expected to survive. One of the younger recruits leaned toward his instructor, voice low. "Is she real?" The instructor didn't answer right away. He just smiled faintly and nodded toward the far end of the range. There, in the haze of heat rising from the dirt, stood a figure in fatigues, calm and steady. Sarah Reeves moved with quiet precision, adjusting a trainee's elbow, checking scope alignment. Her movements practiced and exact. The recruits fell silent as she took a rifle herself, dropped into a prone position, and fired. The distant target clanged cleanly. One perfect shot. As she stood, sunlight caught the back of her neck where the coordinates glinted faintly through the short strands of hair. Once a mark of pain, it now carried the weight of purpose. The sound of gunfire faded, replaced by the hum of cicadas and the steady rhythm of wind across the grass. Some scars, the voice inside the story said, are not meant to be hidden. They remind us of what we've survived and who we've become. The camera lingered on her silhouette against the golden sky, still and unwavering. The ghost of Fallujah lived on, not in myth, but in every soldier who learned from her what it meant to stand and not break,